Fundamentally, as an entrepreneur, you've got to believe something that the rest of the world doesn't believe. The simple thing that I always tell people is anything less than a hell yes is a no. Because most entrepreneurs think their idea is great. And throughout the process of talking to potential customers, they get feedback and invariably they get a bunch of responses. Almost nobody gets the hell yes response, but also on the other end, almost nobody gets a no, that's dumb response. The vast majority of responses live in that middle. That's like, yeah, that's cool, or nice, I like that, because people are nice. And nobody wants to say, that's a bad idea, I'd never use that. So most founders take this as, I'm onto the right thing. But basically what I always tell is, all those people are telling you no. They're just too nice to tell it to your face. So this idea of like anything less than a hell yes is a no. And if you're not getting those pull reactions of where can I sign up or how can I give you my money, then you need to kind of seriously consider a different path.
Welcome to the Product Discovery Show, a show about product discovery done right. We talk to product and design leaders about their on-the-ground stories where user insights made a difference in the success of their product launch. We'll dive into their stories from end to end and the insights that transformed the trajectory of the product. Our guest today is Ian O'Donnell, Director of Design and Validation at Menlo Labs. Menlo Labs is a pre-seed and seed fund of Menlo Ventures, a 48-year-old venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. Menlo Labs exists to help talented builders start companies by combining the hands-on support of an incubator, the investment judgment of a Tier 1 VC, and the capital of a pre-seed fund. At Labs, Ian partners with founders to help them get their first customers, define their MVP and go-to-market approach, and hire their initial team. Prior to Menlo Labs, Ian led startup creation for Fortune 500 clients at BCG Digital Ventures and started his career in user and marketing research for a number of advertising agencies. This episode is dedicated to startup founders who, much more than PMs at bigger tech companies, have an extra layer of ambiguity to navigate through. With startups, you have a totally blank slate product. You have to start with identifying your target customer, whereas with established tech companies, the user base comes pre-built. In this episode, Ian shares his stories about how he helped early-stage founders navigate that ambiguity, how he helped them zero in on the target customer, and identify blank slate product market fit. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to the show, Ian. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me, Jing. Excited.
So Ian, as you know, it's very hard being a startup founder because about 90% of startups ultimately fail. And it definitely, I've noticed, takes a certain type of person to be drawn towards the field to bring clarity to a high level of ambiguity. So I'm sure a lot of people are wondering what initially drew you to this field.
Yeah, great question. So I've always had a love for products and building. Ever since I was a kid, my favorite toy, like a lot of kids, honestly, was Legos. I used to spend hours in my room building kind of these elaborate creations out of Legos. But it wasn't actually just the building part of the Legos that I liked. Like, I loved the boxes. Every time I got a new set, I just look and admire this box before even opening it. I would spend like 20 minutes just kind of looking at the box and being like, oh, I can't wait to play with this. And, as I've gotten deeper into this field of like design and innovation, you really learn how holistic the entire Lego experience is and how much they've thought about every aspect of their product and their product experience. But, that kind of really early on sparked a love of building, creativity, and the product that still inspires me today.
It's so interesting that you mentioned Lego because they really inspire a lot of people in design and research, for example, because you have these building blocks and then everything else is up to imagination. So I think it's the perfect design problem of you have some constraints, right? These blocks that you have to put together, but then the rest is powered by your imagination. And so you've been in design and innovation for over a decade, for quite a long time. What were the places that you found were the defining places in your path for customer discovery?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think if you asked me this 15 years ago or when I was in undergrad, I would have never said I would have been doing something like this. And, I think that's what's been so interesting is that it's been a discovery for me as well. But I think I can really point to kind of three pivotal moments in my career. So first, I started my career out of undergrad in market research. doing mostly like primary quant research. So big segmentation studies, discrete choice and max diff models, kind of anything you can think of under the survey research sun. But a few years into that, I started an advertising agency where I was really starting to mix both quant and qual research. So this was kind of my first taste of doing user interviews, doing shop alongs, things of that nature. But the moment that kind of really clicked for me is we were doing a new business pitch for a client there. And that was the first taste that I had of not working from something existing, but really, hey, we've got to create an entire marketing campaign from scratch, really from the ground up. I said to a colleague of mine after that, I love that. How do I do more of that work? And he pointed me towards design and innovation. And I started to look into consultancies like IDEO and Frog, kind of the leaders of the field at the time. But I really wanted to kind of learn the methodology and learn the proper way to do these types of things. So I started looking at graduate schools, and I came across this place called the Illinois Institute of Technology, or the Institute of Design. And so I ended up doing 3 years at design school there. And I think the second moment that really got me into this field was when I was at school. We had this class called Product Design Workshop. And in that was basically the prompt was to launch a Kickstarter for something, but we weren't really given any more kind of guidance from that. And you get the entire product creation process in that. And you really get to be, we were in school, but you were the CEO of a business in a way, and you had to own every kind of part of that, and really learning how to do customer discovery and user research that informs how you should build this product and how it should influence what you're putting on the website and how it should influence how you're marketing to people. Really kind of gave me a different perspective of how to leverage research for every aspect of a business, not just the purposes of a marketing campaign or specifically related to a product feature. And then, like many of us with grad school, I had a bunch of loans. And so despite my entrepreneurial itch, I had to go and get a real job. And I ended up working for a place called BCG Digital Ventures, big kind of offshoot of Boston Consulting Group. The third moment was really in there after about 2 years that we called it DV. I was leading this project for, basically we were building a hardware and software platform for big oil tankers, where we would take a bunch of data off of the tankers and feed them through machine learning models, basically make recommendations of ways they could optimize their fuel efficiency or prevent downtime kind of before it happened. And if my Kickstarter was the minor leagues of launching a business, this was really the majors of like, okay, how do you fully get a startup off the ground in terms of getting investment in both time and people, but really kind of leveraging all those experiences that I had in research to make sure that everything about that business was grounded in a real user, kind of their real and actual needs, and how they would use a product to help inform what they're doing in their everyday world. So that's really how I got to Menlo Labs, and kind of those three I would consider sort of seminal moments in my product discovery journey.
Such a fascinating journey. And I'm actually curious because I talk to folks all the time about qual versus quant. In your day-to-day now, when do you use quant? So, the market sizing and the survey research and the max divs, do you use it at all, or when, if at all?
Oh yeah. Yeah, we still use it, maybe not to the sort of same extent that you would at a really large company, but the sort of ways that I see qual and quant interplaying with each other is qual, it's much easier to go kind of narrow and deep, whereas quant is much more about kind of going shallow and wide. And so we'll use quant to understand, once we've talk to a bunch of people about their needs, say, how prevalent is this need? How painful is this need? How does this inform how we should price something? So, I love using qual and quant together, and we use those two things together in kind of every company that we work with.
I think what will be really helpful is if we go through a couple of examples where you really helped brand new startups, blank slate startups, really identify the target segment of users and combining the qual and the quant. So I know you had two stories to share today. We'll start with the first one, which is Squint. So for those who are not familiar, can you tell us a little bit about the company and also what were the challenges that they were facing?
Yeah. Yeah. And so full disclosure, Squint is a portfolio company of ours, but I love to tell the story of Devin and this company. And so maybe in a nutshell, Squint is they're now a Series A startup. So they've been in market for about 3 years now. And what they do, they're an augmented reality plus artificial intelligence platform for the manufacturing industries. Now, I know I stuffed a lot of buzzwords in there. Kind of in a nutshell, what they do is if you're an operator on a manufacturing floor and you're having to figure out how do I move this machine from one procedure to another. So the classic example I give is a paper manufacturer. They might be producing Kellogg's cereal boxes in the morning and then trying to think of a different cereal brand's cereal boxes in the afternoon. And throughout the day, that manufacturing line has to be changed over. And there's maybe 45 steps in that process. And the machine is a football field long. And if you're a new operator or a relatively inexperienced operator, the way that you were doing this before is they would have a binder of materials and you would flip through that binder and you'd try to find all 45 spots on that machine and, hope that you didn't do it wrong. Well, often people do it wrong and, that costs the company a lot of money, or really worse, somebody could get hurt if they do that incorrectly. So what Squint allows people to do is basically take a video of a procedure like that. So you can take out your phone, you can literally record. If I'm an experienced operator, I can record a video of me doing all 45 of those steps. And then it leverages generative AI to automatically create an augmented reality procedure where any other operator can come, they can hold their phone up to that machine and it will guide them step by step in augmented reality, say, this is where step one is. They might have a video or a photo in context of how to do that procedure. And so it makes it dramatically easier for people to do that procedure, makes it dramatically better in terms of like the quality of doing that procedure. And on the back end, it allows the supervisor to understand who did that procedure. Did they do it correctly? How fast did they do it? All this amazing insight on how their factory is operating that they didn't have before. So that's what Squint does in a nutshell. I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think I don't come from manufacturing, so this is fascinating stuff. So I might have some naive questions for you, but
Yes.
when you are switching between operators, what are the protocols that they need to switch? Like, are there different buttons that they now need to press from, one zero box to another to create it? Like, what does it mean to switch over operators and where are the errors being made?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a couple of different ways. So operators usually come in shifts. They're typically 8-hour shifts. And so there might be a morning shift and an evening shift where an operator would switch over at that point. And that might be in the middle of a production run, actually. And so there's both switching over production runs as well as switching over operators. And so the switching over of operators, the cool thing that Squint can also do is imagine basically you can place like digital sticky notes in the world. So it's like, hey, the machine over there was making a funny sound. I can go and literally drop a digital sticky note where that was happening and leave that for the operator that's coming on the second shift. So they can pull out their phone, they can be directed to exactly where that was and have that context from the previous operator. So that's one example. And then the production side of things, there can literally be these points all throughout the machine in some of these procedures where, you got to pull a lever this way or you got to turn a knob to this type of thing that, depending on what production run you're doing, imagine it's like the settings for anything. You've got to change the settings for every single kind of run that you have.
Fascinating. Thank you for explaining that. So I'm wondering, let's play kind of time capsule for a little bit. It's 3 years ago, right? This was when the founder approached you somehow and said, what was it? What did they have a technology to start with? What was
Yep.
the initial ask?
Yeah, yeah. So where he started was in a fairly different place. So, the founder, he's a technologist by trade. He's a fantastic engineer. He spent a bunch of time in the early part of his career building in augmented reality. And he sort of had this vision of an augmented reality browser for the world, because his whole thing was, there's lots of information in the world and usually it's attached to physical objects. And he wanted an easier way for people to attach information to those objects and an easier way for people to be able to discover the information associated with those objects. And so his idea was a really easy way to create, we called them primitives. So, audio, video, text, but sort of the basic building blocks that you might have on the internet. Same thing for augmented reality. And he had a technological innovation related to that. But the kind of bigger question was, that's an amazing vision, but where do you start? And he had a bunch of ideas of, we could use it at restaurants for menus. You pull out your phone and the food pops up, or there might be a social network associated with this. We thought about like games that you could play where you like leave, little breadcrumbs for people all over places. But yeah, so the question was really, where do we start? So that kind of led to this approach of, I talked about going shallow and wide earlier. So basically, we brainstormed probably 25 to 30 different starting points that we could realistically see this entering. We thought about sporting event venues. We thought about education. I already mentioned a couple other ones. Manufacturing and industrials was a big one. And so kind of our process was really to figure out, where can we apply this technology in a way that actually had a real need for it, and how augmented reality could uniquely serve this need. So it wasn't just, a hammer looking for a nail.
That's a lot of industries that you started with. So you said 25 industries was the initial.
25 to 30, I can't remember exactly the exact number.
So then that's a lot of conversations. How did you eventually help the founder land on manufacturing?
Yeah. Yeah. So this was probably a 6-week process where we started, think of it as basically a funnel. So we started kind of with 25 to 30 different verticals. We scoped out like, okay, let's have 1 to 2 conversations with somebody in kind of each one of those verticals and really start to understand where we're starting to feel pull. So we probably did 20 conversations in the first 2 weeks. And you're pretty easily able to just cross stuff off and be like, nah, I can't see a way how to do it here. I can't see a way how to do it here. And after a couple of weeks, we were able to narrow it down to about 6 to 8 that we thought had more promise than others, manufacturing obviously being one of them. And so as a part of that, we actually started from the earliest days building prototypes. And I use that term prototype very loosely, but that's a key part of the process that I always take our founders through, is that, if you can't describe what you think the idea is from day one, then you probably need to spend more time kind of thinking about what it could be. But in those early days, we were testing ideas that were basically value propositions. They were like, hey, if we could allow you to do X, what kind of value would that deliver for you? And, you pretty quickly can gauge whether or not people conceptualize that value within an existing kind of workflow. So yeah, after a couple of weeks, we had narrowed it down to 6 or 8 kind of industries. And then we cranked up the fidelity of our prototypes another notch. And so we would have sort of like 3-screen hero moment flows that I call them. So, think about the hero moments of the Uber application is enter where I'm going, book a car, and get out of the car without having to pay anything. Those are kind of the hero moments that we would describe this augmented reality flow in. And it was really just this kind of iterative process towards landing on manufacturing. But really what moved us from, hey, this is, or here's 6 to 8 places that we could consider versus like, this is the one we should go after, was this idea of market pull. And we were really feeling it from manufacturing. Like when we would show people just very rudimentary mock-ups of what we could do, they'd be like, you can do that? Like that would be amazing. Where can I get this? Versus in the other places you were hearing more of like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, maybe I'd try that. So you were really getting people kind of pulling us towards them saying, I need this. I want this right now. Like I can imagine very clearly how this would live in my workflow.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you did all of this in 6 weeks, all of this zeroing in.
Yeah, we had about 45 to 50 conversations in those first 6 weeks.
Okay, so let me see if I got this right. So within the first couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, you brainstormed 25 to 30 industries, had one or two conversations with people within each industry. And what you're pitching to them is essentially a elevator pitch of, if you can do this, what value would it bring you? And then from there, you land on about 6 industries where you feel like, oh, the feedback is pretty positive. And you revisit people from those industries, and this time showing them the 3-screen hero kind of journey or hero pitch of your product. And then what you're paying attention to this time around is a nonverbal pull. So like a spark in people's eyes, or like a natural nonverbal delight where you feel like, oh, there is definitely something here. Does that capture it correctly?
Yeah, exactly. And I would maybe just add, it's a combination of those nonverbal cues that you talked about and sort of the verbal, like, give me this, I want this. And if you kind of never experienced it before, there's definitely a change in kind of tone of voice. You see people start to lean in a way that you just don't with the majority of things.
Yeah. It's very easy to pick up because usually people are pretty monotonous when they're giving feedback. They're pretty straightforward and direct. And then as soon as you hit that magical moment, they're like, whoa, I did not realize this is possible. I live for those moments as well. So from there, what happened? So you were able to really feel that pull from the manufacturing sector. What happened from there on?
Yeah, so the remainder of the time that I spent with the founder, so our engagements are typically between 3 and 4 months. So the remainder, this one was another like 6 to 8 weeks, was, now we're grounded in manufacturing. It was, now we have to go really deep into manufacturing. So I talked about going wide versus going deep. We went wide in the first 6 weeks. Now we're going to go really deep into, okay, what exactly does our sort of target manufacturer look like? So what types of companies are we looking for in the manufacturing landscape? Then within those companies, who's our target buyer versus our target user? Who are influencers within that organization when it comes to both usage and a purchase decision? And what are really kind of the key features that they're going to think of as sort of like these wow features versus what are the features that they're just going to consider parity features. So the things that when they look at anything like this, it's the check the box features of either you have to have them or you kind of just get walked out of the room. So the remainder of that time was very much understanding those 3 things. And so, we did probably another 50 calls, but this was much more targeted within the manufacturing space between a combination of buyers and users. And, what we learned from the buyers was this was still during COVID, maybe not peak COVID, but, November 2021. And manufacturing was still dealing with a huge wave of turnover. And so, we would ask like these plant directors who would be the buyers of these things. And they're like, look, I've got probably 30% of my staff that turns over every 3 months. So think if you've got a production line that has 100 people on it, 33 of those people are going to be new every 3 months. And so they're like, I have a real problem in how to train my people. And so we kind of knew like, okay, That's the value proposition for the buyer. Train your people better, train your people faster. And then the user, I started to touch on this earlier, what was their existing workflow? How were they doing these things today? So we learned about, the binder, where I was like, every machine has a big binder. And it's like, this is how you operate this machine. And think about anytime you've got an instruction booklet for a new product at home, you're flipping through the instruction booklet and you're like, wait, does that look right? It's the exact same thing in these environments, only if they get something wrong, the effect is, thousands of dollars and kind of lost inventory, or like I mentioned, could be injury to workers. So it's really important that they get it right. But yeah, so pretty much the rest of that time was to figuring out, what's the value proposition to the buyer, what's the workflow of the current user, and where would our product fit into that workflow. And based off of those moments in the workflow, what are the key features that we needed to deliver against them? And then, of course, it was also actually getting potential customers to sign on the dotted line of like, yes, I would like to pilot this alongside you. That's ultimately the kind of key definition of market pull that I talked about earlier is someone, I always chalk it up to three things. Will they give you their money, their time, or their reputation before you have anything built? Then you're onto something.
We want that commitment upfront. So
Exactly.
for people who might be new to this, what was your role in all of it? Were you leading all the conversations? Was it split with the founder? What was your role throughout all of those conversations?
Yeah, it was. I sort of characterize it as like a player coach role. And the analogy I always give is, imagine when you go to get your driver's license and you go to driver's ed, and they have these cars. I don't know how many folks have taken driver's ed in America, but they have these cars that actually have steering wheels on both sides. Yeah. So that when you're learning how to drive, the instructor is sitting right there with you and they can turn the steering wheel and, press on the brake if you're doing something crazy. And the way that I kind of characterize it is at the beginning of the process, I'm driving the car, you're sitting there you're sitting shotgun. Then in the middle, we're kind of both driving the car. And then by the end of it, you're driving the car and I'm just like there to tap the brakes or pull us out of the swerve if we're going completely down the wrong direction. It sort of varies throughout time and it evolves, because one of the key things that we're also trying to understand is how well can the founder do this process themselves? Eventually we're going to go away and they need to be able to continue talking to customers, continue iterating on their product, and they're not always going to have us there.
Yeah. So it sounds like you were involved from the get-go, from, the brainstorming of all the industries to the 6 weeks of conversations. What about the in-depth? Were you also kind of helping to model what good customer discovery interviews look like for the in-depth conversation?
Yeah. So probably the first 30 conversations I led. And then everything after that, the founder would lead, and I would be on the vast majority of those calls and, would kind of give him pointers, and both throughout the call and afterwards say, hey, dig deeper here, or, you should have started it out this way, but really being that kind of hands-on guide throughout that process.
So throughout all of those conversations, what were the insights that you saw that propelled the founder to stronger product market fits and also next steps in the product?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned a few of them already. Like the number one thing was that sort of industry context within manufacturing was like, hey, we have a real burning need of turnover that affects our ability to kind of do the core thing that we're in business to do, which is make stuff. And without people who are trained to make it in the right way, we can't make stuff. And so, Squint's key value proposition still to this day is helps your operators make stuff faster and better, which just automatically resonates with every buyer of this. I think then on the user insight, it was really, we had a very deep understanding of the type of workflows that they were going throughout operating their machinery on a day-to-day basis. And I would say one of the key insights that we discovered probably 6 weeks into manufacturing was these folks, they use iPhones at home, but when they get to work, they're using binders or computers that are 20, 30 years old. And so the idea that they could use like modern technology, like consumer grade technology in their work, that dramatically increased their adoption of these tools because they're like, whoa, somebody's thinking about me. Somebody is giving me this type of experience that I don't get kind of every day in my job. And so that was actually an unexpected insight for us, was just if you really understand the context that someone's working in, and it's like, oh, they don't get to experience this in their jobs the way that you and I do, sitting in front of a computer with the latest, MacBook technology. That really got people to say, oh, like this is something I want to adopt and try.
So I really liked how you had those two types of insights. So during the first round of identifying the product market fit, you were really able to identify that manufacturing is the industry to zero in on. And then once you dove deep into the exact workflows of the operators, you found the other insight, which is the painful process that they use right now is they have a full binder of printed out pictures, printed out instructions. So I think those insights are really, really powerful. So now in terms of how to get, these operators to adopt this new technology, right? So it's one thing to say this solution is better than the binder that you're using. What about the adoption itself? Are you familiar with how the company Squint was able to really convince workers to change their workflows and why this is better?
Yeah, and so this is actually where the AI part of the story comes in. So a little bit into the process, or this was maybe a year actually after I had worked with the founder, that's when ChatGPT was launched, and this idea of generative AI was a thing. And one of the biggest actually issues was a bit of this adoption challenge. And it wasn't that workers didn't want to adopt it, but if the content that you needed wasn't already there within the platform, you weren't going to turn to it because it's like, well, I, looked on here and, there's no procedures in there. And so as easy as it was previously to create stuff within Squint, there was still a lot of like, hey, we've got all of our old procedures and PDFs that we printed out. How do we convert those PDFs into procedures? And so this is where AI actually let us easily convert things from one format to another. Or we talked about that idea of taking a video of someone walking through the factory. That made it as easy as just recording a TikTok or a Loom video of yourself walking around the factory and describing how to do a procedure. And that actually was kind of the biggest adoption unlock, because that was I think we found that everybody wanted to use it if the content was there, but someone had to be the author of that content. And even though we thought it was really easy, it still was harder than the inertia of doing nothing until that kind of unlock.
I think it's so fascinating that even with new technology, you need to have the right workflows and the right unlock to get adoption, because it is about changing habits. It is about telling people, hey, instead of that big binder, we now have this technology that is really easy for you to record instructions, is really easy for you to rewatch those instructions. And so getting that change of behavior to happen over time. So I'm not sure how much you can share, but what are some of the next steps or the results of Squint? What are some numbers you can share, if at all?
Yeah. Squint has now been in market for, gosh, I think about 2.5 years now. They've since gone on to raise both a seed and a Series A investment from Sequoia. Those guys are off and running, and really excited to kind of see what their future looks like.
Fascinating. We went from a technology looking for product market fit to such success, right? I think this is really, really good series of lessons for founders, like the founder of Squint, to figure out what's the best way to zero in on an industry, zero in on a value proposition, and really getting deep with your customers. So I know, Ian, you also have another story from your time at Menlo Labs, and that one is a little bit different. So let's talk a little bit about that story. What is that product and what is that company?
Yeah, for sure. Well, spoiler alert, that product or company does not exist because of the work that we do now or that we did. But sort of, so we'll kind of fast forward back or rewind back to the beginning. And so we had two founders that came to us. One was a former HR leader at a large healthcare company, and the other one was a professor of organizational psychology, but had really focused his time on training managers as leaders within organizations. And they came to us with this kind of problem space that we think there's really something lacking in how managers at companies are trained and how they're having conversations with their individual contributors. And we think there's something that technology can kind of really do to help make them better leaders within the organization. And this was about 2 years ago. Everything had switched to Zoom meetings and everybody was in hybrid work. And so we had this idea of, well, what if there was this little bot listening into your Zoom calls that afterwards, the manager got some feedback from the bot that was like, hey, you could do X, Y, and Z better. You weren't listening at this point, or, you ignored that question and said something else, or you weren't empathetic, et cetera, et cetera. You can imagine all the ways that it could do this. So what we did is similar to Squint. We started maybe not quite as broad, but we still started a little bit shallow and wide. We wanted to talk to three kind of key personas. One was obviously the managers, but two was actually their individual contributors, so people that had a manager. And then last was actually the folks who would be the ultimate buyers of a solution like this. So, heads of HR or really people leaders at organizations. And what was really interesting throughout this conversation, these series of conversations, is that the leaders of the organization love the idea. They're like, yeah, if you can make my managers better, that's great. Because, that's one of my biggest kind of challenges is upskilling and training managers on how to be better managers. However, the other two personas didn't really care that much about it for a couple of interesting reasons. One, managers didn't actually, well, first, most managers thought they were pretty good as it was today, which is unsurprising. And then two, how good a manager they are, none of them were actually really assessed on that for job performance. Most folks, when they're up for a promotion, one of the key criteria is not, how well did you manage your people? It's usually, did you accomplish X, Y, and Z kind of business goal? And so those two things made managers not super interested. And you can imagine for a litany of reasons why the individual contributors didn't want this. But, first of all, they're like, I'm far less likely to tell my manager, anything related to how I'm doing in my performance or development if there's a little thought in the room listening to me, because no matter how much you tell me, I'm still going to be concerned about that being used against me for any number of reasons. So that was kind of the context, and there's a little bit more to the story, but I'll pause there.
Managers, it's so interesting that you found most of them thought that they were doing pretty good, pretty well on it, because these are soft skills. It's really hard to assess to say, hey, I feel like my employees are being heard. I feel like they are trusting me with, their challenges. Those are soft skills. It's hard for managers to kind of say, I'm pretty good at it. Do you think it's because there's ego at play? Do you think it's, like you said, the other reason, which is my performance is not evaluated based on soft skills? Which of those do you think is the bigger cause?
Probably more the first one. And so intuitively, like once you have the conversations, it kind of makes sense, because if you are a really good manager, then probably you are getting really good feedback from your direct reports, and you do have a very open and honest conversation. And so case one is you actually are a really good manager, and therefore you feel like a good manager. Case two is you're actually not a very good manager, but due to the fact that you're a good manager, I mean, think about the times that you've had a bad manager. Do you go and tell your manager that they're bad? No,
Yeah,
you don't.
absolutely do not.
But so it's sort of like, oh, okay. Even the bad ones then think that they're good because they never get the feedback that they're not doing very well. So they are kind of living in this, direct reports get feedback from their manager all the time, but managers never get feedback on how they're managing.
Yeah. And, the directors and the HR, they don't sit in on those conversations, so they can never give that feedback. So that's
Exactly.
fascinating. There's a lot of blind spots there. And that was the original intent of the product, right? It was to help managers realize those blind spots. But given that the biggest barrier is probably on the IC level, right? This tool was not going to fly for managers. So what happened from there?
Yeah, so this was where we were, like I said, I was not feeling that pull from the market. And it's interesting because, like I said, the two entrepreneurs kind of came from that more leadership level. So, naturally they were thinking, hey, there's a lot of value here because they were sitting at that buyer persona level. And so they still kind of felt like, oh, well, we think there's something there. And I was like, okay, well, let's go a little bit wider. This is where we brought Quant in, where it was like, okay, let's actually see how much pull there is in the market for something like this. The other thing I'll say here is when we started to kind of not started to sense that there wasn't much there from like a manager IC relationship standpoint, we're like, well, this tool is essentially at its core about relationships. What are other types of relationships where maybe we could help people kind of show up better in relationships? And we started to think about what about romantic relationships? What about parent-child relationships? And so one thing that we do a lot is these things that we call like market viability tests, where we'll actually create fake advertisements that will launch on Meta, Instagram, TikTok, basically whatever is the kind of right channel for where we think our audiences are. And so what we did is we created 3 different sets of advertisements that we targeted at those kind of 3 different relationship types, managers, folks in romantic relationships, folks in kind of parent-child relationships. And we built a fake landing page that's at enter your email if you're interested. We had a few mock-ups on the landing page with the value propositions there. And we launched it for a couple of weeks and we tried to see where is kind of the most pull. And by far the most pull we saw was actually in the romantic relationship arena, which definitely surprised me. I did not think people would be that interested in understanding. I mean, I think intuitively, yes, people want to be better partners, but having a little kind of bot join your meetings with your romantic partners sort of felt a little bit weird. But we got like 160 leads at a really low kind of cost per lead, actually kind of well below benchmarks for the space. And like, okay, this is maybe something we should look into a little bit further. So this is where we really kind of used Quant to actually completely reorient the direction that we were thinking about going.
Actually, I'm curious, maybe a step back. How did you land on those 3 relationships to test rather than, let's say, sibling or family relationships? There's, a wide range that you can go with. How did you zero in on those 3?
Yeah, there wasn't a real solid methodology behind that, I will say. It was kind of really what are the types of things we could think of. And we had heard actually in our conversations with managers, we had heard multiple people say like, oh, this is something interesting I might want to use at home with either my spouse or my kids. And so that was kind of really where we got those 2 ideas from, was actually through our previous conversations starting to point us in a different direction.
And so you ran these fake landing page tests and you were able to get a lot more leads on the romantic side of things, romantic relationships. Is it because one partner is more driven or motivated and basically signed both the entire couple up for this? Or do you have any insight into, is there like a buyer, a decision maker that actually signed us up, or versus they had a conversation and they both decided to sign up? What's kind of the deal behind that?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and that's actually one thing I kind of left out. So originally we had the idea basically be a third party thing that joined, was listening to the conversation and might send feedback to both. After a while, we started to hear like it's going to be really hard to get consent from somebody else in order to do this, which would make me kind of never use it. And so reoriented around this idea of how am I showing up to a conversation? So imagine it shows up and it's not giving feedback to the other person because, voice recognition technology had gotten good enough to where it can pull specific voices out. And so it would only record your side of the conversation. And at the end, if you've ever used Whoop or Aura, these things that give you like 3 scores related to your health and fitness, like how good was your recovery? How much were you exerting? How good was your sleep? We were like, could we do the same thing for you in a conversation? So how dominant were you in the conversation? How patient were you in the conversation? How well were you kind of leading with questions? So we really reoriented the product around this idea of insight into how you're showing up into your conversations, which sort of fed into this like more cultural trend of like people want insights into how they're doing. And that really helped us kind of get around that like idea of, oh, I need to sign us up as a couple for this. I could tell my partner, hey, I'm using this thing because I want to be a better partner and I want to see how I'm showing up to our interactions.
Got it. So I'm guessing this came through in the in-depth. So once you've launched the ad tests, you found out that, oh, romantic relationship is a good target segment. Then you went in-depth. Did you talk to both partners or just one? Or what's kind of the setup for your research there?
Yeah, and I'll be transparent. We had maybe 10 conversations with this, and then we actually quashed the idea for a number of reasons. But the kind of process that we use, so like I said, we set up the fake landing page with ads driving to that landing page. We would collect emails, and then we would email those folks and be like, "Hey, you signed up for." We called it Delphi. You signed up for Delphi. We would love to talk to you more about, why you were interested, what your needs are, and kind of talk you more through the product. And so that's actually how we would go and get the next round of interviews. So it was those people who would kind of raise their hand and said, I want to participate in this. And so we weren't talking to both sides. We were talking to whoever kind of signed up for the landing page.
So you were talking to about 10 of those customers. What did you find that made you ultimately decide, you know what, this is not going to work?
Yeah, it really came down to all of the things you're thinking about in those situations is really think about the actual act of like, okay, I'm in a conversation with my partner. Think of all the conversations you've had with your partner in the past. Some are really great, some are not so great. Even the simplest interaction that we could think of like, hey, pull out the phone and start recording was just too big of a behavior change for people to kind of make that leap of like, oh yeah, I could realistically see myself, at the dinner table, or we're out to a nice dinner and I pull out my phone and say, hey, honey, do you mind if I record this one for me to review later? It was too awkward of a sort of a social interaction to just sort of part of a normal human interaction that's so key in romantic relationships. So I'm not saying we won't ever get there. Maybe when we're all walking around with AirPods recording everything that we do, you would have something like this, but the pulling out the phone interaction was just too big of a hurdle for people to get around.
So help me understand the discrepancy. So 150 people, let's say, signed up for your ad testing. They were interested in the value proposition itself. Why is it hard for them to pull out their phone and actually record the conversation? Why that discrepancy?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, and we've all kind of had this in our lives where it's one of those things that sounds nice in theory, but then when you start to sort of walk people through the actual experience of how it would work. So what we were showing on the landing page was like the insights that you would get out of it. So the end value for the user. When we started to talk to them in depth, they'd have questions of like, well, how does it get those insights? And we'd be like, well, you got to pull out your phone and, you got to tap a button. And they'd be like, ooh, I don't like that. And so you start to kind of walk people through the more holistic experience, and you start to tease out these places where they're much more unsure about the experience than sort of what you're showing them just on landing page.
So it's fascinating because it sounds like the problem exists, right? So people do want to show up as a better partner. They do want
Yeah.
feedback on how they're communicating.
Yeah.
But it's just that the solution right now is not the right solution. Like you said, maybe down the road when we can just auto record everything, every single interaction, then it would be smooth, easy, smooth sailing from there. But right now, the technology is not.
Yep, exactly. And I always sort of come down to this question of like, what's the fundamental behavior change you're making people do that's different? Because no matter what product it is, you're going to have to do something slightly different tomorrow with that product than you did yesterday without that product. And that fundamental behavior change of pulling out my phone and hitting, even if it's one button or there was a shortcut, just felt like too big of a leap for people.
Interesting. For founders who may not have access to you, someone like you, and they're at that split decision of, do I want to keep finding the solution that sticks, or should I maybe just completely shut my company down? How do you navigate that decision with them?
Yeah, it's a great question and one we deal with all the time because fundamentally, as an entrepreneur, you've got to believe something that the rest of the world doesn't believe. And so you balance this, fundamental belief that, hey, there's a better way with what you're hearing from the market and feedback. And the simple thing that I always tell people is anything less than a hell yes is a no. Because most entrepreneurs think their idea is great, and throughout the process of talking to potential customers, like they get feedback and invariably they get a bunch of responses. Almost nobody gets the hell yes response, but also on the other end, almost nobody gets a no, that's dumb response. The vast majority of responses live in that middle. That's like, yeah, that's cool, or nice, I like that, because people are nice and nobody wants to say that's a bad idea, I'd never use that. So most founders take this as like, I'm onto the right thing. But basically what I always tell is like, all those people are telling you no. They're just too nice to tell it to your face. So this idea of like anything less than a hell yes is a no. And if you're not getting those pull reactions of like, where can I sign up or how can I give you my money? Then you need to kind of seriously consider a different path.
Yeah, I love that. Anything beyond a hell yes is a no. Thank you for sharing both Squint and Delphi's learnings. And
Yeah, my pleasure.
I'm sure there's a lot of advice that you can give to founders. Obviously they should reach out to you and try to see if they can partner with you. But for those who may not have access to someone like you, what advice might you give them for how to do customer discovery?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's lots of things there. I think one of my key sort of ideas that I try to tell everybody that a lot of entrepreneurs who don't have a ton of experience, they'll think of like, who's my buyer? And I just need to go find my buyer and do customer discovery with them, see what they want, see what they need. But almost invariably, especially if you're selling to enterprises or to businesses, there's going to be a constellation of stakeholders that you need to understand and you need to map those folks out. So there's going to be your buyer, obviously. But then, like I said, there's going to be your user who's very different than your buyer. And then there's probably also going to be influencers within the organization that aren't necessarily the end user or the end buyer, but IT is the classic one who can throw up roadblocks, who can say like, even if these other two groups want and love your solution, they can be like, nope, that's too hard, or no, we can't integrate with that solution. So you need to really understand not just your buyer, but kind of everyone that influences your buyer within like a business or an enterprise context.
But and I think that constellation is such a great analogy because if selling software is as easy as convincing one person to do it, we will all be billionaires.
Yeah.
So really understanding that dynamic is super important. I'm also going to get a little bit pragmatic. So for founders who want to do your approach of starting with 25 industries and then talking to 1 to 2 people per industry and then going deep, right? Zeroing in on a couple of those and going in deep. I think a lot of founders have a lot of trouble getting recruitment. So, what advice would you give to those founders on how to target the right people, how to even find and get those people to talk to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it varies very much from like industry to industry or customer segment to customer segment. But invariably, there's this commonality of there's communities of people who are either influencers or like very active voices in that community. So in manufacturing, those communities live at trade associations and conferences. We have a company right now that's in the nutrition space, and we spend a lot of time on Reddit forums, and because there's tons of Reddit forums out there related to nutrition and sort of every single subsegment of nutrition you could think of. But really think about, where do the people who are talking a lot and thinking a lot about your category live, and go to those places. That's the best place to find who are going to be the early adopters of a new idea, because they're talking and thinking about that topic all the time.
I love it. And I think the advice is really, really good for especially hard to reach target segments and
Yep.
audiences. Because a lot of times, even, if you're building a B2C product, all you have to do is use a platform like usertesting.com or respondent.io or userinterviews.com, right? And you can get people to fill up your interview slots very easily. But with B2B, it's a lot harder to get those targeted buyers and customers and users. So
Yep.
great advice. Awesome. And then in terms of other types of advice that you might have, so for example, you've sat in on enough of those co-pilot, co-driving interviews with founders. What are some blind spots that founders might have when they're asking questions? Are there certain types of mistakes that they would make, or certain types of questions that they tend to ask that are maybe less productive? And what advice would you give to them for thinking about the right questions?
Yeah, there's a number of them. So I think the number one mistake that I see people make is they want to talk about their idea and their product kind of first. So from a setup perspective, especially early on, you should use 75 to 80% in the first part of the interview to understand the user, understand their needs, and understand the context in which your product could live in. And then you start to test your idea. Now, that split can evolve over time as you get more targeted and you understand the needs better. You can spend more time on the product and kind of less time on the needs, but always make sure that you're understanding the needs first in a conversation. The other kind of big one, and I'll shout out to this book, The Mom Test, which is a great book that I tell everybody about, is this idea of calls don't go well. Like, there's either no resolution or there's an action item at the end. And as a founder, you need to always be moving towards the action item. So the action item could be like, hey, can I set you up with a demo? Or, hey, what's the next step in the procurement process? But getting to a tangible outcome at the end of the conversation is really, really important when you're an entrepreneur. You need to be moving it towards kind of the next action that will move your business along.
Thank you so much, Ian. These are such a wealth of nuggets to dive into. And I think this is especially relevant for entrepreneurs who have to navigate that layer of ambiguity. So before you even have users, how do you find them? How do you identify that target segment? So this is invaluable for them. And thank you for sharing your expertise on how you navigate it with founders. I'm sure by this time, everyone just wants to reach out to you. So what would be the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Yeah. So Menlo Labs, we have two programs. The first one's called our Fellows Program, and that's really for people looking to start a company in the next 6 to 12 months, but they're unsure of their exact idea. Maybe they're exploring a bunch of different paths, and that community is really to meet like-minded folks who are in the same step of their entrepreneurial journey. And we have a number of events, both virtual and in person, for folks that are within that community. So that's the first one. And then the second one is we have an EIR program. And this is for folks who are actively exploring a specific idea or hypothesis. And they're really looking for that highly structured program that I just kind of went through with those two other ideas that's led by myself and the rest of the Menlo Labs team. Both of those things are available on our website. So if you just Google Menlo Labs, there'll be a little link that says apply here. You can go and find an application for both of those on our website.
Ian, this has been a great conversation, and I'm also learning a lot from it. So thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise. And for listeners, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
Thanks so much, Xingjing. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you like this episode of the Product Discovery Show, please subscribe and share it with anyone who's had trouble getting product market fit. You'll save them from the sleepless nights and nerve-wracking product reviews. Background music is composed by our friend Philip Pecker. Thank you and see you in the next episode.